He was 56 years old and he hadn't smiled in 7 years. His name was Alexander Sterling, and he was one of the richest men in the world. He owned hotels in 17 countries. He owned real estate worth billions. He owned companies that employed thousands of people. He owned everything except the one thing that mattered: happiness. 7 years ago, Alexander's wife of 28 years had left him for a younger man. Not just left him. She had destroyed him in the process. She had taken half his wealth. She had turned his children against him. She had made sure that he understood that love was a lie, that trust was a myth, that everything he had believed in was a fantasy. After the divorce, Alexander had made a decision. He had decided that he would never allow himself to feel again. He had decided that love was a weakness. He had decided that the only thing worth pursuing was more money, more power, more control. And for 7 years he had succeeded. He had built an empire. He had accumulated more wealth. He had become harder, colder, more isolated. But he had also become a ghost. A ghost in an expensive suit, moving through a world that he no longer felt connected to. Then came the coffee. Before we start this story, I need you to understand something. This is not a simple love story. This is a story about how one small moment can change everything. This is a story about how sometimes the thing that breaks you is actually the thing that saves you. This is a story about how you can spend your entire life running from vulnerability, only to discover that vulnerability is the only thing that makes you human. This is the story of Alexander Sterling and Emma Richardson. And it's a story about what happens when the most powerful man in the room realizes that power means nothing without someone to share it with. Let's begin. Alexander Sterling's penthouse office was on the 84th floor of a building that he owned. From his window, he could see the entire city. He could see the other buildings that he owned. He could see the world spread out beneath him like it was something he could purchase if he wanted to. His office was decorated in minimalist black and gray. There were no photographs. There were no personal items. There was nothing that suggested that a human being actually worked there. It looked like the office of a machine. And in many ways, that's what Alexander had become, a machine designed for making money and accumulating power. He was sitting at his desk at 6 a.m., as he did every morning. He had already reviewed the international markets. He had already sent emails to his team in London and Tokyo. He had already made decisions that would affect the lives of thousands of people. His personal assistant, Derek, had worked for him for 12 years. Derek was efficient. Derek was professional. Derek never made mistakes. Derek also never spoke unless spoken to, because Alexander had made it clear that he didn't want to hear anything that wasn't strictly business-related. "Your coffee is here," Derek said, setting a cup on the edge of Alexander's desk with perfect precision. Alexander didn't acknowledge him. He didn't even look at the coffee. He just continued working. Derek left the office. Alexander continued working. And for the next 3 hours, Alexander forgot about the coffee entirely. At 9 a.m., Alexander's assistant of 13 years resigned. Derek had finally decided that working for a man who treated him like furniture was no longer acceptable. Derek had decided that he deserved to work for someone who saw him as a human being. Alexander didn't care. Alexander simply told his HR department to find a replacement. He told them to find someone efficient, professional, and invisible. He told them that he had no interest in who the person was or what their background was, as long as they could do the job. HR found someone. Her name was Emma Richardson. She was 27 years old. She had just moved to the city. She had worked as an assistant for the past 4 years. She was intelligent, organized, and desperate for the job because she had just moved to the city and needed to pay her rent. When HR told Emma that she would be working as an assistant for Alexander Sterling, the Alexander Sterling, billionaire, one of the richest men in the world, Emma was terrified. She had heard stories about him. She had heard that he was cold. She had heard that he was demanding. She had heard that he had fired assistants for minor mistakes. But Emma also needed the job. So she said yes. Emma's first day working for Alexander Sterling was the most terrifying day of her life. She arrived at his office at 7:30 a.m., 30 minutes early. She had researched him extensively. She knew his schedule. She knew his preferences. She knew everything that she thought she needed to know to be the perfect assistant. Alexander didn't acknowledge her arrival. He didn't look at her. He didn't welcome her to the team. He simply handed her a folder and told her to organize his files by date and importance. Then he ignored her for the rest of the day. Emma worked silently, trying to be invisible, trying to make sure that she didn't do anything that would cause Alexander to notice her in a negative way. By the end of the day, Emma was exhausted. She had made 17 coffee runs. She had arranged 17 meetings. She had scheduled 17 calls. She had organized his files perfectly. And Alexander hadn't said a single kind word to her. But he also hadn't fired her. So Emma took that as a win. For the next 2 weeks, Emma perfected her role. She learned Alexander's schedule better than she knew her own. She learned that he liked his coffee exactly at 6:15 a.m., 10:30 a.m., and 3:45 p.m., not a minute earlier or later. She learned that he preferred his emails organized by importance and sender. She learned that he had meetings every day at exactly 9 a.m., 1 p.m., and 4 p.m. She learned everything except how to read his mind, which is what seemed to be required to avoid his silent disapproval. Emma was terrified of Alexander Sterling. Not because he yelled or was verbally abusive. He wasn't. He was worse than that. He was indifferent. He looked at Emma like she was a piece of furniture that happened to be able to move and speak. He looked at her like she was invisible. And Emma tried desperately to stay invisible. Because being invisible meant being safe. Being invisible meant not being fired. But Emma Richardson was not very good at being invisible. Emma was naturally clumsy. Emma was naturally warm. Emma was naturally the kind of person who wanted to make people smile and make them feel valued. And working for Alexander Sterling, a man who seemed to have no interest in smiling or feeling valued, was slowly destroying her. Emma began to lose sleep. Emma began to lose her appetite. Emma began to feel like maybe she wasn't good enough for this job. Maybe she wasn't professional enough. Maybe she should just quit. But she didn't quit. Because she was stubborn. And because she believed that somewhere underneath Alexander's cold exterior, there was a human being. She was about to discover just how right she was. It was a Tuesday morning. Emma had arrived at the office at 7 a.m. as always. She had prepared Alexander's coffee at exactly 6:15 a.m. as always. She had organized his emails, confirmed his meetings, and arranged his schedule with perfect precision, as always. At 10:28 a.m., Emma realized she had made a mistake. She had scheduled a conference call for 10:30 a.m. Alexander had explicitly told her that he didn't want any calls during that time. He wanted to review contracts. Emma had made a mistake. Emma's hands started to shake. She grabbed Alexander's fresh coffee from the break room. She walked to his office. She opened the door without knocking, a mistake that would normally result in a reprimand. She was so focused on the mistake she had made that she wasn't paying attention to where she was walking. Her shoe caught on the edge of the carpet. She tripped. The coffee flew out of her hands in a perfect arc, like it was moving in slow motion. It landed directly on Alexander's chest, soaking through his white dress shirt and his custom suit jacket. The suit jacket had cost $10,000. The dress shirt had cost $2,000. The suit was a bespoke creation from a designer in Milan. It was the kind of clothing that only a billionaire could afford to wear casually. And it was now covered in coffee. Emma stood frozen in shock. She waited for Alexander to explode. She waited for him to yell at her. She waited for him to fire her on the spot. Instead, something unexpected happened. Alexander looked down at his suit. He looked at the coffee dripping down his chest. He looked at Emma's face, which had gone completely pale with terror. And then he smiled. It wasn't a small smile. It wasn't a polite smile. It was a real smile. The kind of smile that reaches your eyes and transforms your entire face. It was the kind of smile that suggested that for the first time in years, Alexander Sterling had remembered what it felt like to be human. I think, Alexander said slowly, still smiling, "that this might be the best thing that's happened to me in a very long time." Emma stared at him in confusion. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice shaking. "I'll replace the suit. I'll pay for the cleaning. You'll do nothing of the sort," Alexander said. He stood up. The coffee continued to drip down his suit. And he kept smiling. "Do you know what I was about to do?" he asked Emma. "No," Emma said quietly. "I was about to authorize the firing of 500 employees from one of my companies," Alexander said. "I was going to do it to increase the company's profitability by 3%. I was going to destroy 500 people's lives so that I could have slightly more money." He looked down at his suit again. "And then you spilled coffee on me," he said. "And it reminded me of something I haven't remembered in a very long time." "What?" Emma asked. "That I'm alive," Alexander said simply. "I haven't felt alive in 7 years. And just now, watching you panic about spilling coffee on me, I felt something. I felt human." Emma didn't know what to say. She didn't understand what was happening. "Take the afternoon off," Alexander said. He was still smiling. "Go home. Rest. And when you come back tomorrow, we're going to talk about what just happened here." Emma left the office in a daze. She didn't understand what had just happened. She didn't understand why Alexander Sterling, the coldest, most powerful man she had ever met, had smiled because she spilled coffee on him. But she also couldn't stop replaying that moment in her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about the way his entire face had changed when he smiled. She couldn't stop thinking about what he had said, that he hadn't felt alive in 7 years. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, thinking about Alexander Sterling. She thought about how he had spent 7 years running from vulnerability. She thought about how one small moment, an accident, a mistake, something that could have been a disaster, had somehow changed everything. The next morning, Emma arrived at the office with her heart racing. She had no idea what Alexander wanted to talk about. She had no idea if he was going to fire her. She had no idea if yesterday's smile had been a momentary lapse or something more significant. Alexander was waiting for her in his office. He had changed into a new suit. He was wearing a different shirt. But there was something different about him. His face looked softer. His eyes looked less cold. "Sit down," he said to Emma. Emma sat down. "I want to tell you something," Alexander said. "Something that I haven't told anyone in a very long time." And then Alexander began to tell Emma his story. Alexander told Emma about his marriage. He told her about his wife Victoria, who he had loved with every fiber of his being. He told her about how they had met when they were young and idealistic. He told her about how they had built a life together. But he also told her about how Victoria had changed. He told her about how success had made her bitter. He told her about how wealth had made her cold. He told her about how somewhere along the way, the woman he loved had become a stranger. "She left me for a man who was 30 years younger than me," Alexander said. His voice was steady, but Emma could see the pain in his eyes. "She took half my wealth. She told my children that I didn't love them. She told everyone who would listen that I was a terrible person." "That's awful," Emma said. "It was," Alexander said. "But worse than the betrayal was what I did after. I decided that love was a weakness. I decided that trust was a myth. I decided that the only thing worth pursuing was more money, more power, more control. And I've spent the last 7 years proving that I was right." "But yesterday," Emma started. "Yesterday, I realized I was wrong," Alexander said. "When you spilled that coffee on me, when you were so terrified that I was going to be angry, I realized something. I realized that I had become the very thing I hated most about my ex-wife. I had become cold. I had become distant. I had become incapable of feeling anything except anger and disappointment." He paused. He looked at Emma directly in the eyes. "And then you spilled coffee on me," he continued. "And I realized that I could still feel. I realized that I could still smile. I realized that I was still alive, even though I had spent the last 7 years trying to convince myself that I was dead inside. Something shifted after that conversation. Something shifted between Alexander and Emma, and it was impossible to ignore. Alexander began to see Emma, not as an invisible assistant but as a person. He started asking her questions about her life. He started learning about her. He started treating her like she was valuable. Emma, for her part, began to see past Alexander's cold exterior. She began to understand that his coldness was a defense mechanism. She began to understand that underneath the billions of dollars and the expensive suits and the power, there was a man who was deeply wounded. Over the course of the next month, something unexpected happened. Alexander and Emma developed a connection. It wasn't romantic at first. It was deeper than that. It was the kind of connection that happens when two people truly see each other. Emma would make Alexander coffee at 6:15 a.m., 10:30 a.m., and 3:45 p.m. But now, instead of leaving silently, she would stay for a few minutes. She would ask Alexander about his day. She would tell him about hers. They would talk about books and movies and dreams and fears. Alexander began to change. He began to smile more often. He began to make decisions that were based on compassion instead of profit. He reversed the decision to fire 500 employees. He began to donate to charities. He began to actually engage with the world instead of just observing it from above. The people around him noticed the change. His CFO noticed that he was making decisions that didn't maximize profit. His lawyers noticed that he was becoming interested in philanthropic work. His children noticed that he seemed happier, and they began to reach out to him, hopeful that they might be able to rebuild their relationships. But as Alexander and Emma grew closer, complications began to arise. The first complication came from Alexander's adult daughter, Catherine, who came to visit her father at his office. Catherine was suspicious of Emma. Catherine had watched her father destroy himself with bitterness for 7 years. Catherine didn't want to see him hurt again. And Catherine could see very clearly that Emma was important to her father. "Is this appropriate?" Catherine asked her father privately, referring to his obvious attachment to Emma. "What do you mean?" Alexander asked. "She works for you," Catherine said. "She's your assistant. There's a power imbalance. There's a potential for her to be hurt." "I would never hurt her," Alexander said. "But you could," Catherine said. "You have all the power. She has none. That's not healthy." Alexander understood what his daughter was saying. And he realized that she was right. He realized that as long as Emma was his assistant, as long as she was dependent on him for her job, there was an inherent power imbalance that could prevent Emma from being completely honest with him. The second complication came from Emma herself. Emma was beginning to realize that she had feelings for Alexander that went beyond gratitude or respect. Emma was beginning to realize that she might be falling in love with him. But Emma was also realistic. Emma understood that there was a 29-year age difference between them. Emma understood that Alexander was one of the richest men in the world, and she was a young woman who was still trying to establish her career. Emma understood that the odds of this working out were not in their favor. One afternoon, Emma came to Alexander's office with her resignation letter. "What is this?" Alexander asked, looking at the letter. "I'm quitting," Emma said. "Effective immediately." "Why?" Alexander asked. He looked genuinely confused. "Because I can't keep working for you," Emma said. "Because being this close to you, seeing you every day, and not being able to be with you, it's destroying me." "Who says you can't be with me?" Alexander asked. "Reality," Emma said. "You're my boss. You're 56 years old. I'm 27. You're one of the richest men in the world. I'm a woman who can barely afford rent. We come from different worlds, Alexander. This isn't going to work." Alexander stood up. He walked over to Emma. He took the resignation letter from her hands and he tore it up. "I'm not accepting your resignation," he said. "Because you're right, we can't have a relationship while you work for me. But we're going to fix that." He walked to his intercom. He buzzed his HR department. "I want you to find Emma Richardson a new position in one of my companies," he said. "Give her any position she wants, any salary she wants. But she is no longer my assistant effective immediately. He looked at Emma. Now, will you have dinner with me? He asked. Their first date was at a restaurant on the top floor of one of Alexander's buildings. They had a private room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The food was exquisite. The conversation was even better. For the first time, Alexander and Emma could be honest with each other without the complication of a power imbalance. For the first time, Emma could tell Alexander that she cared about him without fear of losing her job. For the first time, Alexander could be vulnerable with Emma without worrying about how it would affect their professional relationship. They talked about their lives. They talked about their dreams. They talked about their fears. And as they talked, something magical happened. They fell in love. For the next 6 months, Alexander and Emma dated. They spent time together outside of work. They traveled together. They learned about each other's families and friends. They built a relationship that was based on genuine connection rather than proximity or convenience. Alexander's friends were skeptical. Alexander's family was concerned. The media speculated endlessly about their relationship. But Alexander and Emma didn't care. They were too busy enjoying the fact that they had found something that they thought was impossible. But then came the real test. Alexander's ex-wife, Victoria, returned to the city. She had left Alexander for a younger man 7 years ago, but that relationship had ended. She had squandered half of Alexander's fortune. She was now broke and bitter and lonely. And she wanted to reconcile with her ex-husband. Victoria contacted Alexander. She told him that she had made a mistake. She told him that she still loved him. She told him that she wanted to come back. Alexander said no. He said that he had moved on. He said that he was with someone else now. Victoria then did something cruel. She reached out to the media. She gave an interview in which she said that Alexander had only moved on with Emma because Emma looked like Victoria when Victoria was younger. She said that Alexander was trying to recreate the past. She said that Emma was being used. The media ran with the story. Suddenly, Alexander and Emma's relationship became a scandal. Suddenly, people were questioning whether their relationship was genuine or whether it was just a replay of Alexander's past. Emma was devastated. Emma began to doubt herself. Emma began to wonder if Victoria was right. She began to wonder if Alexander was using her as a substitute for his ex-wife. But Alexander was not going to let Victoria destroy what he had built with Emma. Alexander called a press conference. And at that press conference, he told the truth. He said, "I was a broken man when Emma came into my life. I was broken not because of my ex-wife, but because I had given up on the possibility of connection. Emma helped me understand that I could still feel. Emma helped me understand that I was still alive. And I love her. Not because she looks like someone else, but because she is herself. She is brave and kind and genuine. And I am grateful every single day that she had the courage to show up in my life." The media ate it up. The scandal became a love story. And Emma's doubts dissolved like sugar in water. 1 year after Emma spilled coffee on Alexander, he proposed to her. He proposed at the restaurant where they had their first date. He proposed with a ring that he had designed specifically for her. A ring that incorporated both of their birthstones. Emma said yes. Not because of the ring or the money or the status. Emma said yes because she had realized that she had found something rare. A man who had been willing to be vulnerable with her. A man who had been willing to change. A man who had been willing to open his heart again after 7 years of keeping it locked away. Alexander and Emma are married now. The wedding was held in a private garden overlooking the city that Alexander had built his empire in. It wasn't a massive, ostentatious event designed to showcase wealth and power. It was intimate. It was genuine. It was filled with the people who mattered most. Family, close friends, people whose lives had been touched by both of them. Catherine, Alexander's daughter, gave a speech at the wedding. She talked about watching her father transform from a man who seemed to be slowly dying inside into someone who was alive again. She talked about how she had been skeptical at first, how she had worried that Emma was taking advantage of her father, how she had been afraid that he would get hurt again. But then she talked about seeing them together, seeing the way they looked at each other, seeing the gentleness in her father's eyes that she hadn't seen since before the divorce. And Catherine cried as she spoke about how grateful she was to Emma for giving her father back to her. Alexander's son, Michael, also spoke. Michael had been the most distant from his father after the divorce. Michael had believed the things that Victoria had said about Alexander. Michael had thought his father was cold and unfeeling and incapable of love. But watching his father with Emma had changed Michael's mind. Michael had begun to understand that his father's coldness wasn't cruelty. It was protection. It was a man who had been so deeply hurt that he had decided the only way to survive was to stop feeling. Emma's parents also spoke. They talked about how their daughter had been nervous about working for such a powerful man. They talked about how Emma had come home after her first day of work and had said that her boss seemed like a man who had forgotten how to be human. But then they talked about the changes they saw in Emma. They talked about how Emma had started to glow. They talked about how Emma came home excited about her day for the first time in years. They talked about how Emma had found not just a job, but a mission. And they talked about how they had never seen their daughter happier. The wedding night, Alexander and Emma stayed in the penthouse that would become their home. They had chosen not to take a honeymoon immediately. They had decided that they wanted to spend time in their new space, building their life together. The penthouse was initially empty. Alexander had decorated it with the same cold minimalism that had defined his life before Emma. But Emma began to change it immediately. She brought in books. Hundreds of them. She brought in photographs of their time together. She brought in artwork from local artists. She brought in plants and flowers. She brought in life. Alexander watched this transformation happen and he understood something profound. He understood that Emma wasn't trying to change him or remake him into someone else. She was showing him what was possible when you allowed warmth and connection into your life. She was showing him that it was possible to be both powerful and vulnerable, both successful and open-hearted, both ambitious and kind. Within 3 months of their marriage, the penthouse had been completely transformed. It was no longer the sterile office of a machine. It was a home. It was a space that reflected who Alexander and Emma actually were. People who valued beauty and connection and meaning more than cold efficiency. Alexander's office underwent a similar transformation. The black and gray minimalism was replaced with warmer tones. He brought in photographs of his family. He brought in artwork that Emma loved. He brought in a small sofa where he and Emma could sit and talk during the day. His colleagues noticed the change immediately. The office that had once felt like a place of judgment and intimidation now felt like a place where human beings actually worked. But the most significant transformation happened in how Alexander conducted his business. He began to make decisions based not just on profit margins but on human impact. He began to ask himself questions he had never asked before. How will this decision affect the people who work for me? How will this decision affect the communities where my businesses operate? How will this decision affect the world? He discovered something surprising. Decisions based on compassion and connection actually led to better business outcomes. His employees were more loyal. His companies were more innovative. His customers were more devoted. Profit increased not because he was ruthlessly pursuing profit, but because he was creating environments where people actually wanted to work and buy from his companies. 3 months after their marriage, Alexander and Emma established the Alexander and Emma Sterling Foundation. Emma had suggested the idea. She had come to Alexander one morning. It was during their ritual 6:15 a.m. coffee time, and she had said that she wanted their life together to mean something. She wanted their story, the story of a man whose heart had been frozen and a woman whose mistake had thawed it, to become a catalyst for healing for other people who had experienced similar trauma. The foundation would focus on helping people who had experienced emotional trauma, betrayal, and loss. It would provide therapy and counseling services to people who couldn't afford them. It would create support groups for people who had been hurt by the people they loved most. It would fund research into how human connection could be used to heal psychological wounds. Alexander committed $500 million to the foundation's initial funding. But more importantly, he committed himself. He became deeply involved in the foundation's work. He met with people who had been helped by the foundation. He listened to their stories. He understood, in a way that he never would have before meeting Emma, that his wealth could be used not just to accumulate more wealth, but to transform lives. The foundation became incredibly successful. Within the first year, they had helped 5,000 people. Within 5 years, they had helped 50,000 people. The foundation expanded to 17 countries. The foundation became recognized as one of the most effective mental health and trauma recovery organizations in the world. But what Alexander valued most was not the scale or the recognition. What Alexander valued most was the individual stories. He valued the story of a woman who had been emotionally abused by her husband for 20 years and who used the foundation's services to rebuild her life and start a new career. He valued the story of a man who had been betrayed by his business partner and who had become cynical about human nature until he participated in the foundation's group therapy programs. He valued the story of a young man who had contemplated suicide after his parents disowned him and who found hope and healing through the foundation's support services. These stories reminded Alexander every single day why he and Emma had created the foundation. These stories reminded him that his past pain, Victoria's betrayal, his 7 years of isolation, had a purpose. It had prepared him to understand the pain of others. It had prepared him to create something that could actually help people. Alexander's children became deeply involved in the foundation's work as well. Catherine had always wanted to do something meaningful with her life beyond just managing her trust fund. She became the director of the foundation's therapeutic programs. She worked with psychologists and counselors to develop the most effective healing methodologies. She brought her intelligence and her compassion to the work, and she became widely respected in the mental health community. Michael, who had been the most distant from his father, used his talent for technology to create the foundation's digital platform. He developed online support groups and virtual therapy sessions that allowed the foundation to reach people who lived in remote areas or who couldn't afford to travel to in-person sessions. Michael's work expanded the foundation's reach exponentially. Alexander watched his children flourish in this work, and he felt something that he hadn't felt in a very long time: pride. Not pride in their accomplishments in the business world, though they had many, but pride in their commitment to using their privilege to help others. Pride in their understanding that life was not just about accumulating wealth and power, but about using wealth and power to create meaning. Emma, meanwhile, had continued to build her career at one of Alexander's companies. She had started as an assistant, and she had worked her way up. She had earned her promotions based on her intelligence, her work ethic, and her leadership ability. She had refused to use her relationship with Alexander as a shortcut to success. And Alexander, while he would have been happy to help her, had respected her desire to earn her own success. By 5 years into their marriage, Emma was the director of operations for one of Alexander's largest companies. She was respected not because she was married to Alexander Sterling, but because she was Emma Richardson, a brilliant businesswoman who had transformed one of the company's most struggling divisions into its most profitable. She had done it by applying the same principles that she and Alexander had learned together. That business was not just about profit, but about people. That success was not just about the bottom line, but about creating an environment where people could do their best work and feel valued and appreciated. Emma had also become recognized in the business world as an advocate for corporate social responsibility. She had written articles about how companies could be profitable while also being ethical. She had given talks at business schools about how treating employees with respect and dignity actually led to better business outcomes. She had become a role model for young women who wanted to succeed in business without compromising their values or their humanity. Every morning, Emma still made Alexander coffee at 6:15 a.m. But now, instead of leaving silently to avoid disturbing him, she stayed. They sat together on the sofa in their living room, the room that overlooked the city that Alexander had built his empire in. They drank coffee together and they talked about their day. They talked about the foundation's work. They talked about their company's challenges. They talked about their dreams for the future. They laughed. They held hands. They sometimes cried, not tears of sadness, but tears of gratitude for the life they had built together. They remembered the moment when Emma had spilled coffee on Alexander's expensive suit and when he had smiled for the first time in 7 years. They remembered how that single moment had changed both of their lives. Alexander had once believed that vulnerability was weakness. But he had learned through his relationship with Emma that the opposite was true. Vulnerability was the ultimate strength. Vulnerability was what allowed him to connect with other people. Vulnerability was what allowed him to feel joy instead of just pursuing power. Vulnerability was what made him human. Emma had once believed that she needed to be invisible to be safe. But she had learned, through her relationship with Alexander, that the opposite was true. Being visible, being authentic, being genuinely herself, that was what created connection. That was what created meaning. That was what allowed her to be valued not just for what she could do, but for who she was. Their marriage became a testament to the fact that it was possible to find love and connection at any age, in any circumstance, if you were willing to be vulnerable. Their marriage became a beacon of hope for people who had given up on the possibility of connection. Their marriage became a story that transformed not just their lives, but the lives of tens of thousands of people who heard it and who realized that they too could choose vulnerability over isolation, connection over safety, meaning over power. 10 years after Emma spilled coffee on Alexander, they had a daughter. Her name was Sophie, and she was perfect. Alexander held his newborn daughter and he cried. Not tears of joy at becoming a father again, though he was grateful for that. He cried because he understood the gift that he had been given. He understood that his daughter would grow up in a world where vulnerability was valued, where connection was prioritized, where love was not seen as weakness but as the ultimate strength. He looked at Emma, who was exhausted but glowing with the joy of motherhood, and he thought about how far they had both come. He thought about the man he had been before Emma. Cold, isolated, running from feeling. He thought about how he had believed that happiness required wealth and power and control. And he understood with absolute clarity that he had been wrong. Happiness required connection. Happiness required vulnerability. Happiness required being willing to risk getting hurt because the alternative, living a life of isolation, was a slow death. Emma had taught him that. Emma had shown him that with her clumsiness and her warmth and her genuine care for him as a human being. The foundation continued to grow. By 10 years they had helped over 500,000 people. But what Alexander and Emma valued most was not the scale of their impact, but the quality of the lives they had transformed. They valued the fact that they had shown people that it was possible to heal from even the deepest wounds. They valued the fact that they had proven that love could flourish even after betrayal. They valued the fact that they had created a space where people could be vulnerable without fear of judgment. Alexander wrote a memoir. It was titled The Coffee Accident, and it told the story of his transformation from a man who had given up on feeling to a man who had rediscovered the joy of human connection. The book became a bestseller not because it was well written, though it was, but because it was genuine. Alexander poured his soul into the book. He talked about his pain. He talked about his fear. He talked about his transformation. And millions of people read the book and saw themselves in his story. The book was used in therapy sessions around the world. People who were struggling with emotional numbness read about Alexander's journey and found hope. People who had been betrayed read about how Alexander had learned to trust again and found inspiration. People who thought they were too broken to love read about how a simple coffee accident had changed everything and found the courage to open their hearts. Emma also wrote a book, though she was much more private about it than Alexander. Her book was titled Being Visible, and it told the story of learning to be authentic instead of invisible. Emma talked about her journey from being a woman who was afraid to take up space to being a woman who understood that her authentic self was her greatest asset. Emma talked about how meeting Alexander had helped her understand that being flawed and clumsy and imperfect was not something to hide but something to celebrate. Emma's book became required reading in business schools as a case study in authentic leadership. Young women read the book and understood that it was possible to be successful without compromising who you were. Young women read the book and realized that they didn't have to choose between being professional and being human. But perhaps the most beautiful thing about Alexander and Emma's life together was the ordinary moments. The ordinary moments of making coffee together and talking about their day. The ordinary moments of holding hands while watching the sunset from their penthouse. The ordinary moments of arguing about something insignificant and then laughing at themselves for letting it matter. The ordinary moments of being a family. Alexander and Emma and Sophie and eventually their son, Marcus, who was born 2 years after Sophie. These ordinary moments were not just moments between two people who had fallen in love. These ordinary moments were revolutionary. They were revolutionary because they proved that it was possible to have a life of meaning and purpose while also having a life of simple, everyday happiness. They proved that vulnerability and strength were not opposites but partners. They proved that connection was not weakness but the greatest power of all. So here's what I want to ask you in the comment section, and I want you to really think about this. Have you ever felt completely dead inside? Have you ever spent so long running from hurt that you forgot how to feel anything at all? Have you ever wondered if it was possible to come back from that? Because if you have, I want you to know that it is possible. I want you to know that the deadness you feel is not permanent. I want you to know that there is a way back to feeling, back to connection, back to being human. Have you ever made a mistake that turned out to be a blessing in disguise? Have you ever had something go wrong that actually led you to something better? Because sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually gateways to the best moments. Sometimes the most humiliating failures are actually opportunities for transformation. Sometimes the moment we think our lives are over is actually the moment our real lives are beginning. Have you ever met someone who changed your entire perspective on life? Have you ever been changed by an encounter with another person? Because connection has that power. A single genuine human connection can change the trajectory of your entire existence. A single moment of being truly seen by another person can transform how you see yourself and the world. Have you ever struggled with vulnerability? Have you ever been afraid to let someone in because of past hurt? Have you ever had to make the choice between protecting yourself and opening your heart? Because that is the ultimate choice we all face. We can protect ourselves by staying isolated, or we can risk connection. We can keep our hearts locked away, or we can be brave enough to let someone in. Rate this story from 0 to 10. Tell me if it resonated with you. Tell me if you believe that people can change. Tell me if you believe that love is possible even after heartbreak. But most importantly, tell me this. If you were in Alexander's situation, if you had spent years running from vulnerability, convinced that love was a weakness, what would it take for you to open your heart again? What would it take for you to believe in connection? Because this story is not just about Alexander and Emma. This story is about all of us. Because all of us have been hurt. All of us have been tempted to give up on connection. All of us have moments when we wonder if it's worth the risk to let someone in. And the answer is yes. It is absolutely worth the risk. Because the alternative, living a life of isolation and safety, is not really living at all. The alternative is becoming a ghost in an expensive suit, moving through the world but not really part of it. Subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications. Because there are so many stories like this one. Stories about people finding connection when they thought connection was impossible. Stories about vulnerability. Stories about second chances. Stories about how one small moment can change everything. And if you're in Alexander's situation right now, if you've shut yourself off from the world, if you've convinced yourself that love is weakness, if you've decided that the only thing worth pursuing is power and money, I want you to know, there is another way. There is a way to be powerful and also vulnerable. There is a way to be wealthy and also open-hearted. There is a way to be human. And that way starts with a single moment of courage. That way starts with being willing to feel. That way starts with being willing to let someone in. That way starts with understanding that the greatest power you will ever have is the power to love and be loved. I'll see you next time.